Title: Shadowed Nights, Chapter 1. The First Encounter. The night crept into Daniel's bedroom like a living thing, each shadow stretching across the floor and walls, swallowing up the familiar outlines of his room. He was 8 years old and should have been asleep, but tonight felt different. The air was thick, and every sound, the ticking of the clock, the faint creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of a car passing outside, felt amplified, like they were happening right next to his ear. His parents had tucked him in hours ago, leaving the hallway light on, as they always did, casting a faint yellow glow that peeked through the crack under his bedroom door. Daniel lay motionless, his blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes wide open, unblinking. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but every inch of his body was tense, a gnawing unease settling in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. Just as he was about to shut his eyes, pretending to sleep in hopes that he'd eventually drift off, he heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, like a faint breath just above his ear. "Daniel." The voice was low and raspy, carrying a sense of familiarity and menace that sent a chill through his veins. His heart pounded, and he clenched his blanket tighter, forcing himself to stay silent, to stay still. His parents often told him that he had a wild imagination, that he let his fears get the best of him. He'd always believed them, until tonight. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if the owner of the voice were leaning right over his bed, unseen but undeniably present. "Daniel." He dared not move, every muscle in his body tense, locked in place. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he could feel a faint, cold breeze brush against his cheek, as though something, or someone, was exhaling near him. His mind raced with panic, a voice screaming in his head to look, to see if there was something there, yet his fear was too strong, pinning him to the bed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, the shadow on the wall. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a passing illusion, but as he stared, he realized it wasn't moving with the natural flicker of his nightlight. It was still, unnatural. And then, slowly, it began to grow, inching down the wall like spilled ink, stretching toward him with deliberate intent. His throat tightened, and he squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would vanish, that it would be gone when he opened his eyes again. But when he finally mustered the courage to peek, it had only come closer. The shadow now covered half of the wall, thick and solid, defying the faint glow of the nightlight. It wasn't a formless shadow. It had a shape, a distorted, elongated figure with thin, spindly arms reaching down toward him. Daniel's breaths came in shallow gasps, his chest rising and falling as he tried to stay calm. He wanted to scream, to call for his parents, but something about the shadow, about the way it loomed over him, warned him against it. It felt alive, aware of him, as though it were studying him, feeding off his fear. The whisper returned, louder this time, reverberating in his mind. "Come closer." He clamped his hands over his ears, as if he could block it out, but the voice was inside him now, an icy tendril of fear snaking through his thoughts, rooting itself in his brain. He wanted to move, to flee from his bed and bolt for the door, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if the shadow had wrapped around him, holding him captive. The shadow began to shift, its limbs stretching and curling like smoke, reaching the edge of his bed. Daniel watched in terror as one elongated arm lifted, moving with a slow, unsettling grace, until it hovered inches above him. The hand, if it could be called that, was thin and claw-like, fingers long and bony, each ending in a sharp, pointed tip. It descended toward him, inch by inch, until it rested just above his chest. A new wave of dread washed over him, stronger than anything he'd felt before. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst, and he could feel tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. But he was frozen, utterly paralyzed, as the hand lingered above him, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating from it. Then, with a sudden, chilling certainty, he realized that the shadow was more than just a presence. It was watching him, studying him, as if weighing whether or not he was worth consuming. The thought filled him with a sickening terror, a primal fear that he couldn't shake. And in that moment, he knew, deep in his bones, that this was no ordinary nightmare. The hand drifted lower, grazing his chest, and he felt a shock of cold so intense it burned. He couldn't move, couldn't even gasp, as the shadow's touch pressed against him, sending waves of numbness through his body. It felt like his very life was being drained, pulled into the darkness, leaving him hollow and empty. The voice came again, whispering in a tone of satisfaction. "You're mine now, Daniel?" The words settled over him like a shroud, sinking into his mind, a promise that he couldn't escape. The room seemed to darken further, the shadow consuming more of the walls, as if claiming his room, his sanctuary, as its own. It wrapped around him, suffocating him, filling him with a terror so profound that he felt he might vanish into it, become part of it. In a desperate final act, he forced his eyes shut, clinging to the last shreds of his sanity. He told himself that this wasn't real, that it was all just a bad dream, that he'd wake up and find himself safe in his bed. He repeated it over and over in his mind, a silent mantra against the encroaching darkness. Gradually, the room grew quiet, the air warming slightly as the pressure lifted. He could feel the shadow retreating, receding back into the corners of his room, as if satisfied for now, leaving him in trembling silence. He opened his eyes slowly, half expecting to see it still looming over him, but the room was empty. The shadow was gone, the walls once again bathed in the faint glow from the hallway light. Yet he knew, even as he lay there in the quiet of his room, that it was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to close his eyes once more. And as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he could still hear its voice, faint and echoing in the back of his mind, a promise that haunted him long after he woke. Until next time, Daniel. This haunting chapter captures Daniel's first encounter with the supernatural entity, a presence that leaves him in a state of terror and sets the stage for the horrors to come. The shadow's ability to penetrate his thoughts and paralyze him amplifies the sense of dread, introducing a horror that is both psychological and supernatural. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark years had passed since Daniel's first encounter with the shadow, but the memory of it clung to him like a scar. As he grew older, he told himself that the experience had been nothing more than a bad dream, a remnant of childhood imagination. But deep down, he knew the truth. He could never forget the chill of its whisper, the unnatural shape stretching across his bedroom wall, the cold grip that had held him captive. The fear lingered, dormant but alive, waiting for the right moment to resurface. After moving to a new city for a job, Daniel rented a small, quiet apartment tucked away in an aging building at the edge of town. It was the sort of place where people came and went without a word, their faces unfamiliar and indifferent. The building had its quirks: thin walls, an old plumbing system that groaned late at night, and an unsettling chill that filled the hallways, even in summer. But Daniel found solace in its solitude. Here, he felt he could finally leave the haunting memories of his childhood behind. But on his first night in the apartment, that old feeling of dread began to creep back into his mind. As he lay in bed, gazing at the cracked ceiling, he noticed how quiet everything was. No sounds of cars passing, no hum of distant city noise, only silence, thick and pressing, broken occasionally by the faint creaks of the building settling. He turned over, pulling his blanket higher, convincing himself that he was just being paranoid. After all, he had moved here to escape his past, to put those memories to rest once and for all. But then, just as he was drifting into sleep, he heard it, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, drifting through the silence like a breath in the dark. It was soft, a sound so subtle it barely registered, but it set every nerve in his body on edge. "Daniel!" The whisper was unmistakable, low, raspy, and chillingly familiar. His eyes snapped open, and he lay still, his heart pounding, his body frozen, as memories of that night years ago flooded back. He told himself it was impossible, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the voice came again, this time closer, as if someone were standing right beside his bed. "Daniel!" Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave, but his body wouldn't obey. He lay paralyzed, clutching his blanket, feeling a cold sweat bead on his forehead. He forced himself to look around, scanning the shadows of his room, hoping to find some rational explanation. But the darkness seemed deeper, thicker than it had any right to be, and in that darkness, just beyond his line of sight. He felt it watching him, just as it had all those years ago. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to calm down, to convince himself that it was only a dream. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, filling his mind, echoing in the silent room, until he felt he might go mad from it. "Come back, Daniel. I've been waiting." He opened his eyes, fear gripping him, and in that moment, he saw it. A shadow stretching from the far corner of his room, creeping across the floor, reaching toward him with long, spindly arms. It was formless, yet familiar, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A surge of terror shot through him, and he scrambled out of bed, his legs weak and trembling. He backed against the wall, his gaze fixed on the shadow as it writhed and twisted, its limbs stretching across the room like ink spilling over water. The air grew colder, thick with a sense of dread, and he felt the familiar paralysis return, holding him in place. Then, slowly, the shadow began to take shape. A figure emerged, vague and insubstantial, but unmistakably human-like. It was tall, with elongated limbs and hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pull him in, filling him with a horror he hadn't felt since childhood. The figure's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, and the whisper returned, louder, more demanding. "Did you think you could escape me?" Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt trapped, cornered, as the shadow loomed over him, its presence filling the room, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He shut his eyes, gripping the wall behind him, praying that it would disappear, that he would wake up to find it was all a dream. But the cold seeped into him, numbing his fingers, and he knew he wasn't dreaming. The shadow was real as it had been all those years ago, and it was here to reclaim him. A sudden noise broke through the silence, the faint hum of the hallway light outside his door. It flickered, casting a sliver of light into his room, and in that moment, the shadow recoiled, retreating to the far corner, melting back into the darkness. The room was quiet again, but the cold lingered, and he could feel its presence watching, waiting. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat on the edge of his bed, eyes fixed on the corner where the shadow had disappeared, his mind racing with questions and fears. Why had it come back now after all these years? Had it been following him, waiting for the right moment to strike? As dawn broke, he made up his mind. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed answers. Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into researching the paranormal, scouring the internet for any information that might explain the shadow's return. He read about shadow people, malevolent spirits, and entities that fed off fear, but nothing quite matched what he was experiencing. The more he read, the more his fear grew, and the whispers continued, haunting him every night, growing louder, more insistent. "You belong to me, Daniel." He tried everything to rid himself of the shadow. Prayers, rituals, even consulting a psychic, but nothing worked. The whispers persisted, and the shadow grew bolder, appearing more frequently, always lurking in the corner of his room, its eyes fixed on him with a cold, unyielding stare. One night, as he lay in bed, his mind on the edge of sleep, the shadow spoke again, its voice soft and insidious. "Come closer, Daniel. I have something to show you." Against his better judgment, he felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to obey. He rose from his bed, his movements slow, trance-like, as he approached the corner where the shadow waited. His body moved as if under its control, his mind foggy, trapped in a dreamlike state. The shadow extended one of its spindly arms, and he reached out, his hand trembling as it met the cold, insubstantial form. The darkness seeped into his skin, sending a chill through him, and suddenly, he was no longer in his room. He found himself standing in a vast, empty space, surrounded by shadows that writhed and twisted, forming shapes that were both familiar and alien. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers filled his mind, each one carrying a memory, a fragment of his past. The shadows showed him visions of his childhood, moments he had long forgotten, each one tinged with a sense of dread. He saw himself as a child, huddled in his bed, the shadow looming over him, whispering promises and threats. He saw himself growing older, moving from place to place, always trying to escape, but the shadow was always there, watching, waiting. And then he saw the future, a future where he was trapped, consumed by the shadow, his life slipping away, leaving him an empty shell. The visions faded, and he found himself back in his room, the shadow retreating, its whispers echoing in his mind. I am patient, Daniel. I have waited before, and I will wait again. You cannot escape me. The room was silent once more, but Daniel knew that the shadow's words were true. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as he sat in the darkness, he realized with a sinking dread that this was only the beginning. In this chilling chapter, Daniel's fear intensifies as he realizes that the shadow from his childhood has returned, growing bolder, stronger, and more insistent with each encounter. The chapter builds on the horror of his first encounter, blending psychological dread with supernatural terror, leaving Daniel with the unsettling knowledge that the shadow's hold on him is far from broken. Chapter 3: The Marks of its Presence. As the days passed, Daniel's life spiraled deeper into dread and paranoia. The shadow had returned, creeping into his reality like a sickness that no remedy could cure. He felt it everywhere, in the corners of his vision, in the silence of his apartment, in the cold that seemed to follow him like a second skin. Sleep had become a fleeting luxury, a small reprieve he could no longer afford. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers filled his head, taunting him, dragging him into memories he thought he'd buried long ago. On the third night of his ordeal, Daniel noticed something that made his skin crawl. As he turned on the lamp beside his bed, his eyes caught a faint scratch on the wall near his closet. At first, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary scuff, a small imperfection in the aging paint. But when he looked closer, he saw it was deliberate, a rough, jagged line, as though something sharp had scraped against the wall. His heart raced as he traced the line with his finger, feeling a strange energy thrumming beneath the surface. The scratch was cold, colder than the rest of the wall, and the chill seeped into his skin, sending a shiver down his spine. Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't remember making the mark. He hadn't been near the wall, hadn't touched it, but there it was, undeniable, a mark of something he couldn't explain. The rational part of his mind fought to dismiss it as an accident, maybe a leftover mark from a previous tenant. But a darker, quieter part of him, the part that remembered the whispering voice, the paralyzing cold, the lurking shadow, knew the truth. This was no accident. It was a sign, a message left just for him. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the mark on the wall, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadow was still here, lurking somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Every creak, every whisper of the wind outside his window felt loaded with menace. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, the shadows in his room seemed to grow, stretching toward him like dark, twisted fingers. Pass. The next morning, Daniel woke with a start, his heart pounding, his mind still hazy from a nightmare he couldn't remember. He lay there, catching his breath, when his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. The scratch on the wall had grown. Where there had been a single small line the night before, there was now a series of jagged marks, each one deeper, more pronounced, forming an unmistakable shape. It was crude, but he could make out the faint outline of an eye, a dark, hollow eye that seemed to watch him even as he looked away. Daniel's stomach turned. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to run from the apartment and never look back. But he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. The shadow would follow him. It always had, ever since that first encounter as a child. It had waited, watched, and now it was making its presence known in a way he couldn't ignore. The rest of the day was a blur. He tried to focus on his work, on anything that could distract him from the creeping dread in his mind. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark, hollow eye staring back at him, a silent promise of the horrors yet to come. That night, Daniel decided to take action. He couldn't let this thing continue haunting him. It was time to confront it, to face whatever presence had invaded his life and demand answers. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a fierce determination to reclaim his sanity, he set up a video camera on a tripod in the corner of his room, aiming it at his bed. If the shadow was going to appear, he wanted proof. He sat in his bed, his heart pounding, the flashlight gripped tightly in his hand. The camera's red light blinked steadily, a small, comforting beacon in the dark. Hours passed, the silence pressing in on him, broken only by the occasional creak of the apartment settling. He watched the shadows shift in the corners, his mind racing, waiting for something to happen. And then, just past midnight, he heard it. The whisper, "Daniel!" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it filled the room, reverberating through the walls, through his mind. He felt the familiar chill settle over him, wrapping around him like a blanket of ice. He aimed the flashlight toward the closet, his hands shaking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But the closet was empty. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. He scanned the room, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was no sign of the shadow. Just as he began to lower the flashlight, a new sound reached his ears, a faint scratching, coming from directly behind him. Daniel turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, and saw it. The mark on the wall had changed again. The crude eye was now part of a larger design. A twisted, jagged pattern that spread across the wall like a spider's web. The lines were deep, raw, as though carved with something sharp, something that had no place in his apartment. And at the center of the pattern was a new mark, a symbol that he didn't recognize, but that filled him with a primal, unshakable fear. It was a circle, surrounded by strange, angular shapes, with lines extending from it like rays. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, as though it were alive, watching him with an intelligence he couldn't comprehend. The whisper came again, louder this time, filling the room, filling his mind. "You cannot hide, Daniel." The light in his hand flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, taking on shapes that defied explanation. He aimed the flashlight at the wall, his breathing ragged, but the light did nothing to banish the marks. They seemed to absorb it, growing darker, more solid, as though feeding on his fear. Daniel stumbled back, his hands shaking, his gaze fixed on the symbol. He could feel the shadow closing in around him, pressing against him, filling the room with a suffocating darkness that blotted out everything else. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching, reaching for him, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring their prey. In a blind panic, he grabbed the camera and hit stop, clutching it to his chest as he fled from the room. He stumbled into the hallway, his heart racing, the cold seeping into his bones. He didn't stop running until he was outside, gasping for breath, the camera still clutched tightly in his hands. For a moment, he stood in the quiet of the early morning, letting the chill air wash over him, grounding him. He felt foolish, but the memory of the symbol, the marks on the wall, were too vivid, too real to ignore. He knew he couldn't go back into that room, not until he had answers. With trembling hands, he played back the footage on the camera, his eyes glued to the small screen, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what he had witnessed. But as he watched, his heart sank. The video showed nothing but an empty room, the shadows undisturbed, the walls bare. There were no marks, no patterns, no signs of the horror he had seen with his own eyes. It was as if the shadow, the symbols, everything had vanished the moment he'd left the room. And then, just as he was about to turn off the camera, the screen flickered. For a brief moment, he saw something, his own reflection, standing in the room, staring into the camera with hollow, empty eyes, a cruel smile twisting his lips. And behind him, just barely visible, was the shadow, its spindly arms wrapped around his shoulders, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on his own. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him staring at the blank screen, his mind reeling, his body numb with fear. He knew, without a doubt, that he was no longer alone. The shadow was with him, bound to him, an inescapable presence that would haunt him wherever he went. And as he stood there, trembling in the cold dawn light, he heard its whisper again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind like a sinister lullaby. "I'm waiting, Daniel." In this chapter, Daniel's fear escalates as he discovers inexplicable marks in his room, a disturbing sign that the shadow is not only aware of him but is marking his space as its own. The psychological horror builds as he tries to confront the entity, only to realize that its presence is more deeply entwined with him than he ever imagined. This chapter reinforces the supernatural dread and the inescapable nature of the entity, leaving Daniel more terrified and isolated than ever. Chapter 4. The Locked Door. Daniel's nights had become a waking nightmare. No matter where he went in the apartment, he felt the shadow's presence pressing against him, filling the air with a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He couldn't escape it. It was always there, lurking in the corners, scratching at the edges of his mind, pulling him back into its dark embrace. Each night, the terror grew worse, and Daniel knew he had to take drastic measures if he was ever going to sleep again. Desperation had a way of stripping away rationality. One evening, he resolved to lock his bedroom door. He hoped that a barrier, a small act of control, might be enough to keep the entity at bay, to reclaim just a shred of his sanity. He pushed his dresser up against the door for good measure, then took a deep breath, trying to convince himself that he was safe. But the minute the lights went out, the familiar dread settled over him like a heavy blanket. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The faint creaks of the floor, the hum of the radiator, and the ticking of his clock. He lay in bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching him from the corners of the room. Hours passed, and he began to drift into an uneasy sleep. Just as he was about to surrender to exhaustion, a faint scratching sound pierced the silence. It was coming from the door. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat as the scratching grew louder, the sound sharp and insistent, as though something on the other side were clawing to get in. He clutched the blanket, paralyzed, too terrified to move. The scratching grew frantic, more desperate, each scrape echoing in his ears, filling him with a dread so intense that he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. The handle of the door jiggled, a soft metallic rattle that made his blood run cold. He stared at it, barely daring to breathe. The lock held, but the handle continued to rattle, as though the entity were testing it, searching for a weakness, a way to breach the flimsy barrier. "Daniel!" The voice was a low, guttural whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was the same voice that had haunted his childhood, the same voice that had whispered to him in the dark. It dripped with malice, laced with a hunger that filled him with a primal, bone-deep fear. He shut his eyes, clamping his hands over his ears, desperate to block it out, but the whisper grew louder, echoing in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. "Let me in, Daniel!" The scratching intensified, each scrape sounding as though it were right next to his ear. He could picture the shadow on the other side of the door, its twisted limbs stretching toward him, its hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that defied comprehension. He didn't dare move, didn't dare look. All he could do was lie there, paralyzed, as the scratching continued, relentless, driving him to the brink of madness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on him like a weight. He lay there, every muscle tense, waiting, listening. And then, slowly, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving away from the door, retreating down the hallway. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching him, waiting. His exhaustion overtook his terror, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares of hollow eyes and cold hands reaching for him. Of the next morning, Daniel woke with a sense of relief, though it was short-lived. As he pushed the dresser aside and opened his bedroom door, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. Deep, jagged scratch marks marred the door's surface, each one more frenzied than the last, forming a twisted, almost chaotic pattern. His heart sank as he realized that whatever he was dealing with had grown bolder, more aggressive. It wanted him to know it could reach him anywhere. He spent the day in a daze, haunted by the memory of the whispers, the scratching, and the door handle rattling in the dead of night. Desperate for a solution, he began researching old rituals, ways to ward off malevolent spirits, hoping to find something, anything, that could offer him a reprieve. Hours of reading brought him to a ritual he'd never heard of, called The Binding of Shadows. According to what he read, it required items from his past to bind the spirit to a single place. It was risky, the website warned, but if done correctly, it could lock the entity away, prevent it from crossing into his reality. In a small shop on the outskirts of town, Daniel purchased the items for the ritual: a black candle, a small mirror, and a piece of chalk. He hurried home, eager to try anything that might rid him of the shadow's influence. As dusk fell, Daniel set up the ritual. He placed the mirror in the center of his room and drew a chalk circle around it, then lit the black candle and set it beside the mirror. He was supposed to stare into his reflection and recite an incantation to bind the shadow to the mirror. He knelt on the floor, taking a deep breath, his heart pounding as he began to chant. The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign, almost ancient, but he pushed through, his desperation giving him courage. As he chanted, he noticed the shadows in the room shifting, swirling, as though drawn to the circle. The air grew colder, the shadows thickening, twisting into strange shapes. His reflection in the mirror began to distort, darkening, his features twisting into something unrecognizable. But he didn't stop. He kept chanting, his voice growing louder, more insistent. Just as he finished the last line, a loud, piercing sound filled the room. A scream, shrill and agonizing, as though the very walls were crying out in pain. The candle flickered, and the mirror cracked, spiderwebbing from the center outward. The shadow recoiled, retreating to the far corners of the room, leaving him gasping for breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The ritual had worked. He could feel it. The presence was still there, but its power had been diminished, its grip weakened. He slept that night without the weight of the shadow pressing down on him, and for the first time, he didn't wake to whispers or scratching. Days passed, and Daniel's life began to return to normal. The shadows no longer seemed as oppressive, and the cold that had lingered in his apartment finally dissipated. He dared to hope that he had freed himself from the shadow's influence, that he had won. But then, one night, he woke to a sound that sent his heart racing. The scratching was back. It was faint, subtle, as though the shadow were testing the boundaries, searching for a weakness. He sat up in bed, his pulse pounding, and stared at the door. The marks from before were still there, a haunting reminder of the entity's presence. And as he watched, he saw new scratches beginning to form, as though an invisible hand were carving them into the wood. The whisper returned, faint but unmistakable. "Did you really think you could bind me?" The voice was different this time, darker, angrier, filled with a malevolence that made his blood run cold. The air grew thick, pressing down on him, suffocating him, and he realized, with a sickening dread, that the shadow had not been bound. It had been waiting, growing stronger, biding its time. The door handle began to rattle again, more violently than before, as though something on the other side were trying to tear it off. He scrambled back against the wall, clutching his blanket, his mind racing. The shadow wasn't just a presence in his life anymore. It was a force, a malevolent being that would stop at nothing to break through. With a sudden surge of desperation, he lunged for the mirror on his dresser, hoping to somehow use it to repel the entity. He held it up, watching as the shadow twisted and writhed, its shape contorting in anger, the hollow eyes glaring at him from the reflection. But the shadow didn't retreat. Instead, it pressed closer, its whispers filling the room, drowning out his thoughts. "You are mine, Daniel. You always have been." The mirror cracked, splintering in his hands, and the shadows closed in, consuming him, wrapping around him like a shroud. And in that moment, Daniel realized the horrible truth. The shadow had never been bound. It had bound him, trapping him in a nightmare that he would never escape, a prisoner of its dark, relentless will. As the darkness closed in, his last thought was a single, haunting question. How long had it been watching him, waiting for this very moment? The door to his room creaked open, and the shadow slipped inside, embracing him with cold, hollow arms. And the whispers, filled with victory, echoed in his mind, promising that he would never be alone again. For in this chilling chapter, Daniel's efforts to protect himself with a locked door and ritual backfire. as the shadow's power only grows stronger, more relentless, trapping him in an inescapable nightmare. The horror escalates as he realizes he is helpless against the entity, which has been waiting patiently for the chance to claim him fully. The chapter ends with Daniel's fate sealed, a dark promise of horrors to chapter 5. Echoes in the darkness. After the harrowing encounter with the shadow, Lisa insisted on staying with Daniel, fearing for his safety and determined not to leave him alone. They both knew the entity would return, but Lisa hoped that her presence might offer him some comfort, some strength to face the creeping dread that haunted his every waking moment. However, as night fell, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, thickening the air with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on their chests. Daniel barely spoke, his mind still reeling from the shadow's taunts, the way it had declared itself a part of him. He couldn't escape the voice echoing in his mind, whispering in a tone that was both foreign and familiar. As they sat in the living room, wrapped in silence, Lisa broke the tension. "Daniel, I've been thinking, maybe there's a way to understand what this thing is. There has to be something connecting it to you." Daniel's gaze was distant, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's always been with me. Since I was a kid, it's been there, waiting." He paused, swallowing hard. "But it's getting worse. I don't think it just wants to scare me anymore. It wants more." Lisa shivered but kept her voice steady. "If it's true that it's bound to you, maybe we can find out why. There has to be a reason, something that ties it to you. We need to dig deeper, find anything that might weaken its hold." Though skeptical, Daniel nodded. Desperation had eroded his resolve. He would do anything to escape this living nightmare. Together, they decided to revisit his past, searching for any clues that might explain the origin of this relentless shadow. The following day, Daniel and Lisa began their investigation at his childhood home. He hadn't been back in years, and the sight of the house sent a shiver down his spine. Memories, hazy and distorted, flooded his mind. Nights filled with whispers, shadows stretching across his bedroom walls, the growing terror of something lurking just out of sight. The house felt like a place frozen in time, haunted by a darkness that had only grown in his absence. They knocked, and an elderly woman, his mother, answered the door, her face lighting up in surprise at the sight of her son. "Daniel, what a surprise!" She ushered them inside, her warm demeanor a stark contrast to the cold, heavy atmosphere that permeated the house. But as she glanced at him, her expression shifted, a hint of worry in her eyes. "You look tired, dear. Is everything all right?" Daniel hesitated, unsure how to explain the horrors that had plagued him. But he needed answers, and so he told her everything: the shadow, the whispers, the marks on his walls, and the relentless feeling of being hunted. His mother listened, her face growing pale, her eyes clouded with an emotion he couldn't quite place. When he finished, she sat silently, her gaze distant, as though lost in thought. Then finally she spoke, her voice low. "I hoped it would never come to this. I hoped you'd forget." Daniel's heart pounded. "Forget what?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "When you were young, you always talked about the shadows. You'd say there was something in your room, something that watched you, whispered to you. Your father and I thought it was just childhood fears. But as the years went by, things started happening. Strange things. Doors would open and close on their own. Objects would move. And then you started sleepwalking." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Sleepwalking?" She nodded. "We'd find you wandering the house in the middle of the night, your eyes open but empty, like you were somewhere else, and you'd whisper things, words that didn't make sense. You'd talk about someone waiting for you, calling to you." A cold dread settled over him. He had no memory of these episodes, no recollection of ever speaking to anyone in his sleep. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "I thought it was just a phase. But one night, I found you in the basement, standing in the dark, whispering to someone, or something, that I couldn't see. It was as if you were speaking to a shadow on the wall. You looked so lost, so empty. And then Just as I reached out to wake you, I felt it. A cold, dark presence. I can't explain it, but I knew it was real. Daniel's skin prickled with fear as he listened. It was as if a part of his past had been hidden from him, concealed by a veil of suppressed memories. So, this thing, it's been following me since I was a child. His mother nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I tried everything to protect you, prayers, rituals, even moving houses. But it always found you. No matter where we went, it was there, watching. I hoped that, as you grew older, it would leave you alone. But it seems it only grew stronger. A heavy silence filled the room, and Daniel could feel the weight of his mother's words pressing down on him. The shadow wasn't just a ghost, an entity haunting a place. It was something tied to him, a force that had chosen him, marked him as its own. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but firm. We need to find a way to end this, Daniel. There has to be something that can break its hold. His mother shook her head, her face etched with sorrow. I don't know if it can be broken, but there's one thing. Something we never told you. She rose from her chair, crossing the room to a dusty old cabinet. She opened it, retrieving a small worn box. She handed it to Daniel, her hands shaking. Inside the box was an old, tattered notebook, its pages filled with strange symbols and notes scribbled in a language he didn't recognize. This belonged to your great-grandfather, she said quietly. He was different. People in the family said he had a connection to the other side. He used to talk about shadows, about entities that fed off fear. He said they could attach themselves to people, follow them through life, feeding on their souls. Daniel's hands trembled as he leafed through the notebook, his eyes scanning the faded ink, the cryptic symbols. What is this? It's a record of his encounters. He claimed he had found a way to summon and control these shadows, but it came with a price. He warned us never to speak of it, to leave his knowledge buried. But I kept the notebook, just in case. As he read the entries, Daniel's mind reeled. The writings spoke of rituals, bindings, and a dark force known only as the Watcher, a shadowy figure that could slip between worlds, drawn to those with fear in their hearts. His great-grandfather had believed that once the Watcher marked someone, it would follow them relentlessly, feeding on their terror, growing stronger with every fearful thought. Lisa leaned over, reading along, her face pale. It says here that the Watcher can only be severed by confronting it, by facing it head-on in the place where it first appeared. Daniel's heart sank. That would mean returning to the basement, the dark, cold room where his mother had first found him speaking to the shadows. And that night, Daniel returned to his apartment, the notebook clutched tightly in his hand. Lisa had insisted on joining him, and together they prepared for what would be the ultimate test of his courage. They set up a circle of candles in the center of his living room, a makeshift barrier against the darkness. The notebook lay open at the center, its pages filled with arcane symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As midnight approached, Daniel felt the familiar chill settle over him, a cold dread that seeped into his bones. The air grew thick, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, stretching toward him with a hunger that sent a shiver down his spine. Lisa held his hand, her grip firm. We can do this, Daniel. Whatever happens, I'm here with you. He nodded, forcing himself to breathe. With a shaky voice, he began to recite the incantation from his great-grandfather's notebook, his words trembling as he called to the Watcher, demanding it reveal itself. For a moment, there was silence, and then, from the shadows, a deep guttural whisper filled the room, sending a wave of terror through him. You called, Daniel, and I am here. The shadow emerged, dark and twisted, its form towering over him, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. Its hollow eyes fixed on him, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across its face. You think you can be rid of me? I am every fear, every doubt, every shadow you've ever known. I am part of you. Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced himself to hold its gaze. You don't own me. You never did. I'm taking back my life. The shadow laughed, a sound that echoed through the room, chilling him to the core. But he stood firm, reciting the incantation louder, his voice filled with a defiance he hadn't known he possessed. The shadow writhed, its form flickering, weakening under the force of his words. But it fought back, its whispers turning into screams, filling. Chapter 6. Descent into the Abyss. The ritual had left Daniel and Lisa exhausted, but also with a glimmer of hope. The shadow's form had weakened, retreating momentarily into the darkness. For the first time, Daniel felt he had taken back a piece of his life, his courage slowly replacing the fear that had haunted him for so long. Yet, deep down, a gnawing dread remained. He knew that whatever force bound the shadow to him was stronger than just an incantation. It was an ancient bond that couldn't be broken so easily. In the days that followed, Daniel dared to believe he was free. He slept through the night without hearing whispers, without the suffocating sense of eyes watching him. But there were moments, brief, fleeting, where he felt a cold breath on his neck, saw shadows shifting unnaturally out of the corner of his eye. He told himself it was paranoia, that his mind was playing tricks on him after so many nights of terror. Lisa, sensing his unease, stayed close by, offering comfort and encouraging him to let go of the shadow's grip on his mind. Then, one evening, as they sat together on the couch, the silence around them grew thick, pressing, as though the air itself were turning solid. Daniel felt it first, a subtle change in the atmosphere, a chill that crept into his bones. Lisa must have sensed it too, for she looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Daniel, do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his heart pounding as he felt the oppressive presence return, filling every corner of the apartment, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He knew what it meant. The shadow had come back, stronger than before, hungrier, its anger simmering in the darkness. As the lights in the room dimmed and flickered, Daniel took Lisa's hand, his grip tight. "It's here." The shadow emerged from the corner of the room, its form darker, more solid than it had ever been. The familiar hollow eyes and twisted smile were there, but its shape had changed, grown more monstrous. Long, spindly limbs stretched across the room, claws that scraped the walls, leaving deep dark marks in their wake. The air filled with a faint metallic scent, and Daniel realized with a shudder that the marks on the wall weren't just scratches. They were bleeding, oozing a thick, dark liquid that trickled down to the floor. Lisa's breathing quickened, her eyes fixed on the shadow as it loomed closer, its hollow gaze never leaving Daniel. "What does it want?" she whispered, clutching his arm. "I don't know," he replied, his voice shaking. "But it's stronger now. I don't think it'll let me go this time." The shadow's voice filled the room, a deep, echoing growl that seemed to vibrate through their bones. "You thought you could banish me, Daniel?" It laughed, a sound that was both mocking and sinister, like nails scraping across metal. The walls around them seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the shadow's voice, the shadows growing darker, swallowing the light until only the faint glow of the streetlight outside remained, casting an eerie yellow hue over the room. "I have waited, watched, grown stronger. You belong to me, and nothing can sever that bond." Daniel felt his strength draining, his knees growing weak as the shadow advanced, its twisted limbs reaching out, wrapping around him. He struggled to pull away, but his body felt heavy, rooted in place, as if invisible chains bound him to the spot. Lisa screamed, reaching out to pull him back, but the shadow was relentless, tightening its hold, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He could feel its cold, sharp fingers digging into his skin, seeping into his bones, a force so overwhelming that he could barely breathe. "Let him go!" Lisa's voice was shrill, desperate, her hands gripping Daniel's arm as she fought to pull him free. But the shadow only laughed, its hollow eyes flickering with amusement as it turned its gaze on her. "Would you like to join him, little one?" it taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "I could consume you too, bind you to this darkness, forever." Lisa's face went pale, but she didn't back down. With a surge of defiance, she reached for the remnants of the mirror shard they'd used in the previous ritual, holding it up toward the shadow as if to ward it off. For a moment, the shadow recoiled, its form flickering, its claws loosening around Daniel. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, the cold grip releasing him. But his relief was short-lived. The shadow reassembled itself, growing even larger, as if feeding off their fear. You cannot escape, Daniel. Not now, not ever. In that moment, a realization struck Daniel with the force of a lightning bolt. The shadow wasn't just a presence haunting him. It was a part of him, an entity tied to his very soul. Every attempt he had made to rid himself of it had only strengthened their connection, deepening its hold on him. It was feeding off his resistance, his fear, every desperate action making it stronger. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice filled with a grim resignation. I think it's been bound to me all along. Every time I tried to fight it, it just got stronger." She looked at him, horror dawning in her eyes. "Then what do we do?" He hesitated, his mind racing. The notebook from his great-grandfather had hinted at a final ritual, something that would force him to confront his greatest fear and sever the connection once and for all. But it was risky, dangerous, and the text had warned that failure would mean complete surrender to the entity. "We have to perform the last ritual," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. "It's the only way. I have to face it completely, without fear." Lisa nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they moved to the center of the room, drawing a new circle with chalk, surrounding themselves with candles. Daniel held the notebook in his trembling hands, his eyes scanning the text for the final incantation. The words felt foreign on his tongue, heavy with a power he barely understood. As he began to chant, the shadow grew agitated, its form twisting and writhing, its whispers turning into screams of fury. "You cannot sever me, Daniel. I am every fear, every doubt. I am you." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a dread so deep it felt like his soul was being pulled into the abyss. But he kept chanting, his voice growing louder, stronger, as he forced himself to confront the shadow, to face the darkness without flinching. The room grew colder, the shadows pressing in, but Daniel held his ground, focusing on the incantation, on the memory of every moment this entity had stolen from him. He thought of the sleepless nights, the constant fear, the way it had haunted his every thought, and as he chanted, he felt something shift, a loosening in the shadow's grip. The shadow screeched, its form flickering, wavering as though struggling to maintain its hold. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, filled with a rage so intense it nearly broke his concentration. But he held steady, his voice rising above its screams, drowning out its taunts. With a final, desperate cry, the shadow surged forward, its form disintegrating into a mass of darkness that wrapped around him, filling his vision, his mind. He could feel it invading his thoughts, his memories, everything that made him who he was. It whispered to him, offering promises, threats, a life bound to eternal darkness. But he pushed back, fighting with every ounce of strength he had left. "I am not yours," he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "I never was." The shadow let out one final deafening scream, its form shattering, dissolving into nothingness as the candles flickered and died. The darkness lifted, and Daniel fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body racked with exhaustion. Lisa knelt beside him, her face filled with concern. "Daniel, did it work?" He looked around the room, the silence thick and heavy, but there was no sign of the shadow, no trace of its presence. For the first time, he felt free. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long was gone, leaving only a hollow ache where the shadow had once been. But as he looked into the mirror's shattered reflection, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In his own eyes, deep within, a faint flicker of darkness remained, a small, subtle reminder of the entity that had haunted him. It was gone, but not entirely. With a sinking feeling, Daniel realized that the shadow had left its mark, a piece of itself imprinted on his soul. Chapter 7. The Residual Darkness. The nights following the ritual were eerily calm, almost unsettling in their silence. Daniel found himself caught between relief and an unshakable sense of dread. The shadow was gone, or at least he told himself that. But a part of him, deep and instinctual, felt that it was merely lying dormant, waiting. The faint flicker of darkness he had glimpsed in his reflection haunted him, as if a small part of the shadow's essence had seeped into his soul. hidden yet waiting for the right moment to resurface. Lisa stayed with him, as much out of concern as to keep herself grounded in the strange reality they had just endured. But as the days passed, she too seemed to sense something lingering, an unease that neither of them could shake. One evening, while they were sitting quietly in the living room, Lisa spoke up, her voice tentative. "Daniel, do you feel it too?" He hesitated, glancing at her, then nodded. "It feels like it's still here. Not as it was, but like a shadow of a shadow. I can't explain it." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I see it sometimes, in my reflection, a flicker in my eyes." She looked at him, her face pale. Maybe it left a piece of itself behind. Maybe it's tied to you now. Daniel's stomach churned at the thought. The idea that the entity, even in part, could still be connected to him was almost too much to bear. They'd endured so much already, yet the darkness felt closer than ever, a silent threat lurking in the background. As night fell, Daniel felt the familiar chill creeping through the apartment, the air growing heavy. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but Lisa's presence did little to ease his fear. Together, they prepared for bed, both sensing that the quiet might only be temporary. Traps! Around midnight, Daniel was jolted awake by a strange sensation. He felt weightless, disoriented, as though he were floating between wakefulness and sleep. A heavy fog filled his mind, making it difficult to distinguish reality from the nightmare he felt creeping up on him. He sat up, glancing around the room, and froze. In the corner, barely visible in the darkness, he saw it. A faint, barely perceptible outline of the shadow. It wasn't fully formed, but rather a whisper of itself, like an echo left behind. Its hollow eyes were no longer empty, but rather mirrors, reflecting his own image back at him, distorted and twisted. Daniel's heart pounded, his body paralyzed with fear. He could feel it reaching out, not physically, but mentally, clawing at his thoughts, his memories, pulling at every fear he had ever buried. He heard a faint whisper in his mind, soft and insidious. "You thought I was gone, Daniel, but I am part of you now." He stumbled back, gripping the edge of his bed, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lisa stirred beside him, awakened by his movements. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and followed his gaze to the corner of the room. Her face drained of color as she saw the same flickering form, the faint outline of the shadow watching them. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's still here." The shadow's gaze shifted to her, its form stretching, expanding as it seemed to absorb their fear. Daniel realized with a sickening certainty that the shadow was feeding, growing stronger, using their terror to fuel itself. He fought to steady his breathing, forcing himself to look away from its hollow, empty eyes. I don't know how to get rid of it," he said, his voice trembling. "The rituals only weakened it. I thought I had severed the connection, but it's still tied to me." Lisa gripped his arm, her eyes fierce despite her fear. "Then maybe we need to confront it in a different way. It's part of you now, right? What if that's the key?" He stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "If it's tied to you, maybe fighting it only makes it stronger. You've been running from it, resisting it. But what if you faced it fully, accepted it?" Her words struck him with a strange clarity. The shadow thrived on his fear, his resistance. Every attempt he'd made to rid himself of it had only strengthened their bond. Perhaps, he thought, the only way to sever the connection was to confront it without fear, to face it as part of himself. I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The thought of fully acknowledging the shadow, of accepting it as part of him, was terrifying. Lisa held his gaze, her expression resolute. "I'll be here with you. Whatever happens, you're not alone." With her words giving him strength, Daniel took a shaky breath and turned back to the shadow, its form flickering, shifting in the darkness. He forced himself to meet its gaze, to look into those hollow eyes without flinching. Slowly he spoke, his voice steadying as he addressed the entity. "You're a part of me, aren't you? You're not just some external force. You're my darkness, my fear." The shadow didn't respond, but he felt a shift, as though it were listening, watching him with a new intensity. Daniel continued, forcing himself to confront the memories that the shadow had fed on. The sleepless nights, the paralyzing fear, the doubts and anxieties that had haunted him since childhood. He acknowledged each one, feeling the weight of them settle over him like a heavy cloak. But instead of resisting, he accepted them, letting the memories wash over him, no longer running. The shadow trembled, its form flickering as though uncertain. Daniel could feel its grip loosening, the connection weakening as he embraced his fear rather than pushing it away. And then, he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet strength, "I won't fear you anymore. You're a part of me, but you don't control me." For a moment, there was silence. The shadow's form began to dissolve, unraveling into wisps of darkness that floated into the air. Daniel felt a strange sensation, as though a weight were lifting from his soul, a final release from the entity's hold. The shadow faded, leaving only darkness in its wake. He looked at Lisa, her face filled with relief and disbelief. She reached out, taking his hand, her touch grounding him, anchoring him in the reality that the shadow was truly gone. "You did it," she whispered, a small smile breaking through the fear that had lingered for so long. "You faced it, and you're free." Daniel nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. He felt lighter, as though the shadow's presence had been lifted from his soul, leaving him whole for the first time in years. But even as relief flooded through him, a small, lingering feeling remained, a faint flicker of darkness that he couldn't quite shake. The following days were peaceful, the apartment filled with light and warmth that had been absent for so long. Daniel felt as though he had emerged from a long, dark tunnel, finally able to breathe again. He no longer saw shadows lurking in the corners, no longer heard whispers in the night. But as he looked into his reflection one morning, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. There, in his eyes, was a faint glimmer, a subtle darkness that reminded him of the shadow's hollow gaze. It was barely visible, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a remnant of the entity, a reminder of the darkness that had once claimed him. He realized with a quiet resignation that though he had confronted the shadow, a part of it would always remain within him, a faint echo in the depths of his soul, and he knew that the shadow would be watching, waiting for a moment of weakness, a slip into fear that might allow it to reclaim its hold. As he turned away from the mirror, he felt the faintest whisper echo in his mind, a chilling reminder that the shadow was not entirely gone. "I am here, Daniel. Always." Chapter 8. The Awakening of Shadows. The days passed in a quiet, tentative peace. Daniel tried to settle into normalcy, but the shadow's memory lingered like a stain on his consciousness. He knew Lisa sensed his unease. She had been his anchor, but even she couldn't help him escape the lingering dread that clung to him. Every time he looked into his own reflection, he saw that faint glimmer in his eyes, a darkness that was not fully his own. He began to notice small things, subtle changes in his behavior. At night, his dreams were filled with visions of dark corridors, twisting shadows, and hollow eyes watching him from every corner. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, his mind filled with whispers that he could barely remember. But the feeling they left behind was unmistakable. The shadow was still part of him, woven into his very being. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he felt the familiar chill creeping in. He glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The silence was thick, pressing down on him, and he realized that Lisa hadn't stayed over tonight. The darkness seemed more profound in her absence, the apartment larger, emptier, and somehow alive with an energy he had tried to forget. As he sat there, he noticed a strange sensation, a faint tugging in his mind, a pull toward the mirror in the hallway. He tried to ignore it, to focus on anything else, but the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, as though something were calling to him from within. Finally, unable to resist, he rose from the couch, his feet moving almost of their own accord. He stood before the mirror, his reflection staring back at him, eyes dark and empty. The faint flicker he had seen before was stronger now, more defined, a shadow lurking in his gaze, And then, without warning, his reflection smiled. Daniel staggered back, his heart pounding. He hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched, but his reflection was grinning, a cruel, twisted smile that sent a shiver down his spine. The reflection tilted its head, studying him, its eyes hollow and dark. Who are you?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, the smile never faltering. Daniel felt an invisible pressure against his chest, as though the reflection were reaching out, pulling him closer. Then, it spoke, its voice low and cold, echoing in his mind. "You thought you could banish me, Daniel. You thought I was just a shadow, a figment of your fear." Daniel's pulse quickened, his breaths coming in short gasps. "No, I defeated you. I faced you." The reflection's smile widened, its eyes glinting with malice. "Did you? Or did you merely give me what I needed? A place to hide, a piece of yourself to feed on?" Daniel shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "You're lying. I broke the bond. I'm free of you." The reflection chuckled, a hollow echoing sound that filled the room. "Free, oh Daniel. You welcomed me in. You made me a part of you. And now, I am awake." As the words settled over him, Daniel felt a creeping horror, a realization that tightened his throat. The shadow hadn't been defeated. It had been lying in wait, hidden within him, biding its time. And now it had found a way to resurface, stronger than before, entwined with his very soul. The reflection's face began to change, shifting and distorting, becoming something monstrous. The eyes grew hollow, the smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and too many, a grotesque parody of his own face. It was as if the shadow were shedding its disguise, revealing its true form within him. Daniel stumbled back, his heart pounding as the room seemed to close in around him. The walls twisted, the shadows stretching and contorting, filling every corner with a darkness that felt alive. He could hear whispers, faint and mocking, echoing from the depths of his own mind. "You are mine, Daniel. You cannot escape me." He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder, reverberating in his skull. And then, he felt it, a cold, suffocating presence wrapping around him, tightening like a vice. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, swallowed by the darkness that filled his mind. He could feel himself slipping, his thoughts growing hazy, his identity blurring as the shadow's influence seeped deeper, consuming him from the inside. Images flashed before his eyes, memories twisted and corrupted, moments from his life tainted by a dark presence he hadn't known was there. He saw himself as a child, standing alone in his room, speaking to the shadows. He saw his own face in the mirror, grinning back at him with a malevolence that wasn't his own. The realization struck him like a cold blade. The shadow had been with him all along, hidden in the recesses of his mind, shaping his fears, feeding off his pain. Every attempt to resist it had only strengthened its hold, allowing it to root itself deeper until it had become inseparable from him. "Accept it, Daniel," the voice whispered, soft and insidious. "Accept the darkness, and I will grant you power beyond your wildest dreams. We can be one, united, unstoppable." Daniel gritted his teeth, fighting against the pull, the seductive promise that filled his mind. He knew that if he gave in, if he accepted the shadow's offer, he would lose himself completely, becoming nothing more than a vessel for its dark will. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I won't let you win." The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure rage. The room shook, the shadows swirling around him, pressing in from all sides. He felt the entity's anger, its frustration, as it struggled to assert its control. "You are weak, Daniel. You've always been weak. That's why I chose you." The words stung, cutting deep into his soul, but he clung to his defiance, refusing to let the shadow's taunts break him. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Daniel forced himself to look into the mirror, meeting the entity's gaze head-on. He focused on his own face, the features that were his, and his alone. grounding himself in his identity, his humanity. "You are not me," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You may be a part of me, but you do not define me. I am not your puppet." The shadow let out a furious scream, the sound so loud that it seemed to shake the very walls of the apartment. But Daniel held firm, his resolve unshaken. As he stared into the reflection, he saw the darkness in his eyes begin to fade, the hollow gaze retreating, replaced by his own. He could feel the shadow's grip loosening, its hold weakening as he reclaimed control over himself. But even as the entity's presence diminished, he knew that the battle was far from over. The shadow would always be there, lurking in the depths of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. It was a part of him now, a scar that would never fully heal. Exhausted but resolute, Daniel lowered his gaze from the mirror, feeling a sense of quiet victory. He had faced the shadow, confronted the darkness within himself, and emerged with his identity intact. Lisa found him the next morning, sitting in silence, his face pale but calm. He didn't need to explain what had happened. She could see it in his eyes, a newfound strength tempered by the weight of what he had endured. They shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged in the face of unspeakable darkness. And as they looked into each other's eyes, Daniel knew that he would never be truly alone in his fight. The shadow was still there, a faint whisper in the back of his mind, a flicker in his reflection. But for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a fragile but unbreakable resolve to live his life free from its control, because he knew deep down that the greatest victory he could achieve was not in erasing the darkness, but in living despite it. Chapter 9. Whispers in the Blood. The days that followed Daniel's confrontation with the shadow were uneasy. Though he had reclaimed a part of himself, he knew the shadow's presence lingered. It was like a dark stain on his soul, something he could not wash away. But he convinced himself that, with time, the darkness would fade, that he would grow stronger than it. Lisa, who had remained by his side, was the one stable presence grounding him in reality. Yet as the days turned into nights, her eyes held a trace of worry that Daniel chose to ignore. One evening, as the sun set and shadows crept through the apartment, Lisa excused herself to visit her family in a nearby town. She hesitated before leaving, searching his face for signs of distress, but Daniel managed a calm smile, urging her to go. She deserved a break from the torment that had plagued them both. As the door clicked shut behind her, Daniel's heart sank into the familiar silence, his only company, the lengthening shadows that stretched along the walls. He could feel a faint but persistent prickling at the back of his mind, an uncomfortable reminder that the darkness within him was still alive, still watching. Hours passed, and as midnight approached, the familiar chill settled over the apartment. He sat alone in the dim light, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. He wanted to ignore the feeling, to pretend it was just his imagination, but a whisper slid through the quiet, faint but unmistakable. "Daniel!" The voice was his own. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. He looked around, expecting to see his reflection staring back at him from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the thick, suffocating darkness filling the room. "You thought you were rid of me," the voice murmured, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You thought you could sever our bond." Daniel clenched his fists, his body tense. "You don't control me. You're just a memory, a scar." The voice chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made his skin crawl. "Am I? Or am I something much more?" As the words echoed through the room, Daniel felt a strange, pulsing sensation in his chest. It was a cold, sharp pain, as though something were trying to tear its way out of him. He clutched his chest, gasping, his heart racing as the pain spread, filling every nerve, every cell. The darkness within him was growing, writhing, a presence that felt more alive than ever. With a shudder, he stumbled to the bathroom, flicking on the light. He stared into the mirror, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. And there, in his own reflection, he saw it. The shadow, faint but visible, swirling in his pupils, a dark entity lurking within his gaze. "I am you, Daniel. And you? are me. The word sent a chill through him, a realization that struck him with a sickening dread. The shadow wasn't just haunting him. It was becoming him, blending with his thoughts, his emotions, twisting his very identity. He backed away from the mirror, his mind racing. Every step he took left a trail of whispers, faint murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls, from his own skin. The apartment felt smaller, suffocating, as if it were closing in on him. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. He ran to the living room, desperate to escape, but no matter where he turned, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. He could feel the shadow's presence pressing against his mind, slipping into his thoughts, filling him with images of dark corridors, blood-stained walls, and hollow eyes staring back at him. He stumbled, clutching his head, his thoughts fracturing under the weight of the shadow's influence. This isn't real, he told himself. It's just the fear. It's just in my mind. But the whispers disagreed. I am your truth, Daniel. I am your essence, and I am hungry. A sudden, sharp pain shot through his body, and he doubled over, gasping. It was as if his very blood had turned to ice, freezing him from the inside out. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring as darkness clouded his thoughts. In the haze, he saw flashes of memories, twisted and corrupted, a childhood filled with shadows, a life haunted by a presence that had always been there, lurking in the corners of his mind. With a surge of terror, he realized the shadow wasn't just part of his recent life. It had been with him since birth, a dark passenger that had fed off his fears, his pain, his very essence. And now, it was taking him over. He staggered to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to escape the apartment before the shadow consumed him completely. But as he reached for the door, his hand froze, his body refusing to obey him. "Leaving so soon?" the voice taunted, dripping with malice. "There is no escape, Daniel. You belong to me." He tried to scream, to fight, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if weighed down by an invisible force. The darkness spread through him, filling his veins, his muscles, his mind. He could feel his own consciousness slipping, drowning beneath the shadow's influence, his thoughts fracturing as the entity took control. He stumbled back, his movements jerky, unnatural. His own body felt foreign, a puppet controlled by a force he couldn't see, couldn't resist. In the back of his mind, he heard his own voice screaming, trapped, powerless as the shadow tightened its hold. And then, with a sickening clarity, he realized that he was no longer the one in control. His body moved without his will, his hands reaching out to touch the walls, leaving dark, bloody smears in their wake. He felt the entity's thoughts mingling with his own. Dark and twisted images flashing through his mind. Images of pain, of violence, of a hunger that could never be sated. The apartment around him seemed to warp, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes, faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, reaching out for him, whispering his name. He could feel their cold touch, their voices filling his mind, drowning out his own thoughts, his own identity. In that moment, he understood the true horror of the shadow. It wasn't just an entity that haunted him. It was a part of him, a dark reflection of his own fears and desires, twisted and corrupted into something monstrous. And now, it had taken control. He felt his own lips curl into a twisted smile, his eyes hollow and empty, filled with a darkness that was not his own. The shadow had won, had consumed him, leaving nothing but an empty shell, a vessel for its own dark will. And as he stood there, staring into the darkness, he knew that he was lost, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The shadow was in control now, and he was nothing more than a prisoner, a silent witness to the horrors that it would unleash. The last remnants of his own consciousness slipped away, leaving only darkness, only hunger, only the shadow's cold, unyielding will. And in the silence, in the suffocating darkness that filled his mind, he heard one final whisper, a promise that would haunt him for eternity. "You are mine, Daniel, forever." Chapter 10. The Abyss. The moment Daniel's consciousness slipped away, the shadow settled comfortably into its new vessel, testing its hold. It moved his fingers, flexed his muscles, twisted his face into grotesque, unfamiliar expressions. Daniel was aware of it all, trapped deep within his own mind, a silent observer to the horror that was now his life. He could feel the shadow's thoughts, a dark presence pressing against his own, squeezing out everything that was him, but he refused to surrender completely. The shadow, sensing his resistance, laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that echoed through his mind. It delighted in his torment, savoring every flicker of terror, every thread of doubt. "You thought you could resist me, Daniel, fool. You opened the door and let me in, and now you're nothing." Daniel felt his own voice echo in the apartment, his lips moving without his will. His body, now under the shadow's control, moved through the rooms, touching familiar objects with a twisted curiosity. He could feel the entity's hunger, a dark need that pulsed with every movement. It wasn't content with just taking him. It wanted more. It wanted to extend its reach beyond him, to leave a trail of horror in its wake. As the night wore on, the shadow began to test the limits of its new vessel. It moved to the kitchen, picking up a sharp knife, letting the cold metal reflect Daniel's hollow, empty eyes. With a flicker of amusement, it pressed the knife against Daniel's skin, drawing a thin line of blood. The pain was dull, distant, a reminder of how little control Daniel had over his own body. He wanted to scream, to pull back, but his voice was lost in the darkness that consumed him. The shadow, however, was not satisfied with these small tests. It wanted to leave a mark, to ensure that everyone around Daniel knew that he was no longer the person they once knew. And so it waited, biding its time, savoring the anticipation. The next morning, Lisa returned, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As she unlocked the door and stepped into the apartment, a chill swept over her. The air felt heavy, thick with a presence she couldn't quite identify. She called out, her voice hesitant, tinged with worry. "Daniel, are you here?" The shadow forced Daniel's body to respond, a twisted smile stretching across his face as he turned to greet her. "Yes, Lisa. I've been waiting for you." Something in his tone made her pause, her brow furrowing as she took in his appearance. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, as though a piece of him were missing. She took a cautious step forward, her gaze fixed on him, searching for the Daniel she knew. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The shadow tilted Daniel's head, feigning curiosity. "Why wouldn't I be?" it replied, twisting his words into something cold, mocking. "After all, you were the one who encouraged me to face my darkness, weren't you?" Lisa's eyes widened, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. She tried to back away, but the shadow was faster, closing the distance between them, its movements unnaturally swift. Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, his grip bruising. She gasped, the fear evident in her eyes. "Daniel, you're hurting me," she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow leaned in, forcing Daniel's lips to stretch into a smile that felt foreign. "Wrong. Hurt you? Oh, Lisa, you have no idea what pain is." Daniel, trapped within his own mind, screamed silently, struggling against the shadow's hold. He fought with everything he had, trying to break free, to reach Lisa, to warn her. But the darkness held him tight, smothering his thoughts, drowning his voice in an ocean of shadows. The shadow released her wrist, watching with amusement as she stumbled back, fear etched into every line of her face. It could feel her terror, her confusion, and it relished in it, feeding off the dark energy that radiated from her. "Daniel, please. You're scaring me," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. But the shadow had no intention of stopping. It forced Daniel's body to take a step forward, then another, backing Lisa against the wall, trapping her in place. It leaned in close, so close that she could feel the coldness radiating from him, the emptiness in his gaze. "You wanted to help me, didn't you, Lisa?" the shadow murmured, its voice a mockery of Daniel's own. "So why are you so afraid now?" She looked into his eyes, searching desperately for any trace of the friend she had once known. But all she saw was darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with shadows that writhed and twisted, hungry for more. With a final, desperate attempt, she reached out, placing a trembling hand on his chest. "Daniel, if you're in there, please, fight this. You're stronger than it. You don't have to give in." For a brief moment, Something flickered in Daniel's gaze, a spark of recognition, a faint glimmer of his true self. He felt her words pierce through the darkness, pulling him back, grounding him. He fought with everything he had, clawing his way to the surface, forcing himself to reach her. Lisa, he managed, his voice strained, weak. He felt control returning, just for an instant, enough to look at her, to truly see her. But the shadow was furious, its grip tightening as it fought to reclaim him. It surged forward, flooding his mind with darkness, drowning out the last remnants of his resistance. Daniel felt himself slipping, the spark fading, as the shadow reasserted its dominance. With a final, mocking laugh, it pushed him down, burying him beneath layers of darkness, leaving only an empty shell in its wake. When Daniel's gaze returned to Lisa, it was no longer his own. The shadow had taken full control, its influence complete, and any trace of Daniel was buried too deep to resurface. Lisa's face crumpled, the realization sinking in that the friend she had once known was gone, replaced by something cold, something inhuman. She took a shaky step back, her hands trembling. The shadow watched her, its amusement tinged with a dark satisfaction. It leaned in, its voice a low, sinister whisper. "He's gone, Lisa. Daniel is nothing more than a memory now. And soon, you will be too." Before she could react, the shadow lunged, its movement swift and unnatural. Lisa screamed, stumbling back, her eyes wide with terror as it closed the distance, its intentions clear, its hunger insatiable. But in that moment, a sudden burst of light filled the room, a blinding, pure light that forced the shadow to recoil, hissing in pain. Lisa turned, shielding her eyes, her heart pounding as the darkness writhed, struggling against the light that seemed to burn it from within. She didn't know where the light had come from, but she felt an overwhelming sense of relief, a glimmer of hope that perhaps Daniel wasn't completely gone. The shadow screamed, its form twisting, contorting as it fought against the light, the darkness within it burning away, piece by piece. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she heard Daniel's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Lisa, run!" Without a second thought, she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the apartment as the light continued to fill the room, pushing back the shadow, weakening its hold. As she reached the door, she cast one last glance back, her heart aching as she saw Daniel's form standing in the center of the room, his face a mix of agony and determination. She knew, in that moment, that he was fighting, that he was still there, trapped but not defeated. The last thing she saw before the door closed behind her was Daniel's eyes meeting hers, a silent plea that she understood all too well. And as the darkness swallowed him once more, she ran, vowing to find a way to free him, to save him from the shadow that had claimed his soul.